Hello and welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we're reviewing Perfect Days. Directed by Wim Wenders, Perfect Days follows Hirayama, a toilet cleaner who works in Tokyo. The film follows his structured, ritualized, everyday life that he repeats daily from dawn. The film stars Kōji Yakusho in the main role. So Jeffrey, what did you think about Perfect Days?
So I'll start with Wim Wenders. He's a classic and very, very well-renowned filmmaker. I had this literature professor in college that had this line that he would say that at a certain point, art becomes so renowned that the art is judging you more than you're judging the art. That's the kind of legendary status that Wim Wenders has in the art world. I have seen two of his films, which are Wings of Desire and Paris, Texas. I really enjoyed both of them, and I think that they're objectively extraordinarily well made, but I didn't have this spiritual transcendence with either of those films that I wanted to have. I just didn't quite get there, and I've actually been eager to revisit both those films and some of his other filmography as I've read more about Wim Wenders. It's actually interesting. I've probably spent a lot more time reading about Wim Wenders than I have actually watching his films, because he's had a very, very vivid and strong filmography. Not only films that are very influential, but a lot of films that really flew under the radar. I made a joke that I now know is kind of ignorant after reading about him more, that it's kind of odd that he's a German person making a Japanese film, submitting as the Japanese entry for the Oscars. Little did I know that he's made all of these kind of, I don't want to call them underground exactly, but maybe off mainstream films I haven't heard of about Japanese subjects and Japanese people for years. And I just haven't seen them and didn't know about them. So no matter what I've thought of those films, and I didn't have these transcendent moments with him, like his film Paris, Texas won the Palme d'Or. So who am I? He's part of the canon. He's a very essential filmmaker.
Like you just said, maybe it's judging you at this point.
Yeah, exactly.
You used that on me before, by the way.
No, I know, but I also I try to be fair and use that on myself. There's something established great in his films that I don't always see. But he's known for this meandering style. He loves a road movie, and he also is known for keeping these deep, passionate emotions very hidden that come up in very climactic moments in the film, and we'll probably talk about that a little bit here. I think Perfect Days is this really extraordinary elegy of everyday life and the beauty and mundanity. It's a film that I said to you, I think when it ended, the first thing I said is it doesn't have a mean bone in its body, and that's true. For as cynical and dark as my taste often is, to watch a film that feels so, enlivened by life and invigorated by life rather than downtrodden about it was really a miracle to see. We were fortunate enough to see this at the Yale Film Archive. They've been doing some great work around us, and we got to see it with a full crowd, which was a lot of fun. As soon as the film ended, it was just rapturous applause that you could tell that the crowd was really feeling what this movie was about. I genuinely hope that after watching this film that I can administer some of its simple elegance of just living life into my own life.
Going from there, I completely agree with you. I absolutely love the aesthetic of this movie. I love its poeticism. I love the simplicity of it and how grounded of a film it was. You had mentioned it being a film about mundanity, and I want to expand a little bit on that to start, because I found this film to be so much more than about the mundanity of day-to-day life, because this film purposely breaks from the rules of mundanity by changing things from sequence to sequence. This is shown to us in a myriad of ways, which I can't wait to get into. But to start, I do want to talk a little bit about how the film is organized and edited together. And it really just follows our main character, Hirayama, through a series of days. Every day starts and then ends and then begins again, and we get to see day-to-day life. The first one seems pretty benign, nothing's really happening, but as the days progress, there'll be little things that are introduced, different characters, different locations that he goes to, some which he goes on a day-to-day basis, and others which he might go every other few days.
It almost seems like he has a different routine for his days off than he does for his days that he works. But also, we get to see both of those routines in detail, and there are some things that come about, nothing monumental, but there are some things that come about that disrupt his routine and send him to do something else.
One of the other great things about this movie is his character is he pretty much doesn't say anything at all. Then there's a point later on down the film that he does speak, but the first time we hear him speak, it's to a very particular person. He has a deep enough relationship with this person that he could actually talk to them.
But all of that considered, he might have less than 20 lines in the entire movie?
Yeah.
I mean, I'd have to put them together, and I think most of them are in a scene towards the end by the river.
And for him to win Best Actor at Cannes Film Festival with a performance that has no more than about 20 lines is absolutely insane. But after watching the film, you understand completely why.
I say I take no issue with that. Yeah, I thought he was extraordinary in the film.
Yeah, there are so many little micro changes in his looks, and I'm getting ahead of myself from what I was started earlier, so I want to backtrack just slightly. This film has a lot going on for it, and I have so much jumbled in my head.
I just want to say really quickly before you move on from like the idea of details and how they change. There's a film I've talked to you a lot about, and I've talked about on the channel a couple times called Jean Dielman from the 70s. It's a French film, and it's basically about a woman cleaning her apartment and like cooking and stuff. It follows a very similar trajectory in ways that when she does something that's a little bit out of the norm after we get to know her routine, it feels very like, oh, we're supposed to notice that.
Yeah.
But that film, and I'm not going to spoil it because I want to watch it with you at some point, that film has very, very different intentions than this film does. So I was interested to see how this film has kind of a poeticism and like a warmth about life that frankly that film doesn't really have, and uses all of these ideas for different reasons. It was like taking the same idea and reframing it in a very interesting way.
I'm so glad you said that, because there's so much about this film that just rests in the details. You're so engaged with those little details that when the routine is changed in any way, you notice it. Going back to the beginning, I love the intro to this film, because normally you would have an establishing shot introducing us to the location or where we're at. And this film so brilliantly makes the decision to start with a bunch of close-ups. A guy sweeping in the street, and then we see Hirayama waking up and doing his little routine of getting ready in the morning. And then after he leaves his house to go to work, that's when we get our first main wide shot that establishes where we are and what everything looks like.
Oh, it's so great
And
that
the
you
place,
noticed that, yeah.
and the reason this is so important and integral to this film in particular is because it's a film about his simplistic life. And so when we see the world in a bigger sense, we see his little tiny piece in the world. And this plays such an important part later in the film when there's a couple of lines with his niece.
You're gonna make me cry. Stop talking right now. You're completely right, and that's also the film has a great soundtrack, and it decides to withhold its soundtrack until around the time of that wide shot, and it's like we're coming into the world from his perspective. We were in his head, in his interiority for the beginning portion of the film, and as he goes about his life and starts walking into the world, that's when we're exposed to the music, which is kind of a cool touch.
And we're also exposed to the way that he interacts with the world as a whole, as big as it is. Because, for example, on his drive to work, there's this main shot that's on the highway, and there's two vehicles that quickly pass by him on both the left and right side. And that in itself was a little detail about how leisurely he drives. He's not rushing to get somewhere. He's planned his timing perfectly.
You're killing me right now.
Also, when he's in the car, you see cars passing by him through the window. So it just enhances that leisurely aspect of his life, the simplicity. So much of this film in the details is related around simplicity for him.
Yeah, this is why we're a good team, because I'm like overall thematic, Wim Wenders, film history, blah blah blah, and you bring all of these great details and the way that the composition of the filmmaking brings its way into the details. I love that. The general outlook of what you're saying is it's a film that's so rigorously detailed, and maybe most surprising of all, it's actually pretty entertaining. Like the film finds a rhythm in its portrayal of routine that's not only consistently engaging, but also fairly touching. There's a few scenes where this happens in the film, and actually Wim Wenders talked about this before the film. There's like a little tape segment where he talked about what the film means to him and why he made it, and it's based off a concept in the Japanese language of the way that the sun comes through the trees and the various shadows and light. When he has a second, or when he's been kicked out of the bathroom because somebody needs to use it and he can't clean it anymore, he just takes a second to look at that. And the only thing you can do as a viewer is just exhale. Like you just feel calm, like, you know? I thought that was a really extraordinary moment, but the way that this film intertwines the routine with these more touching kind of subtle moments that our main character has, it's just really extraordinary. They're almost childlike in a way in their simplicity, but they have this like aching existentialism about them that I think becomes more notable in the film's second half. It strikes this just terrific tone early on.
So I do want to talk a little bit about the mundanity of everyday life and how this film really subverts that idea. And one of those is how the film is shot. And this was one of the most amazing things I thought about this movie was the difference in which certain scenes were shot from day to day. And the best way I could describe this is there's this place that he goes to underground to eat dinner sometimes. Every day he goes here and the guy just brings him a drink and he's like, here's for a hard day's work. And he gives him a little piece of food, like an entry level thing, like a snack before he gets dinner. The wonderful thing about this scene is that even though it plays over multiple days, there's very specific and intentional choice being made here to shoot this sequence from a different viewpoint and framing.
Oh, you're right.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, you're right. Because we don't see the whole restaurant until The final
right
time.
till the end.
Wow. Oh, yeah. Okay. I
Yeah.
did not notice that.
So there is one shot that takes place looking at a table from one particular direction. So we see the restaurant, we see his table. The next day that he goes there, we see it from a different view of his table, and we get more of the atmosphere behind him. And then in one of the final shots, he can't sit at the same seat. He has to switch
it's
seats
so
because
busy.
the place is so busy. The guy runs up to him, throws him his drink, says, "Here's for a hard day's work." He doesn't get his little intro appetizer snack.
Yeah.
He is stuck at a different chair that I noticed can't even see the baseball game on the TV, which he watches every time.
Yeah. Oh my gosh,
But
that's great.
the fantastic thing about this, and I've noticed this throughout all the other sequences as well, the place that he frequents is, they're shot with different framing and different angles for every day that he's living them. I have a wonderful point that I'll put into my wrap-up section towards my grades that ties the film together because I need something to say there. But I want to talk a little bit about another little detail in the movie that is paid particular attention to, and that's the skyscraper. I think it's a very simple metaphor, which is just showing materialism versus his life, which is very simplistic. We see it in the film many times, but there's a moment where his niece actually references it and points to it and says almost like what a beautiful tower it is. And he just brushes it off and is like, eh. That metaphor just is another layer of the difference between materialism and simplicity in this film and the way you live your life.
There's a scene in a cassette shop or like a record store where he could easily sell all of the cassettes he has for all this money because they're from the 80s, they're original, they're, people look for them, and they're more meaningful to him than they are for him to sell them for all this money.
Yeah.
He just doesn't value that. And I know there's a scene later where he runs out of gas and he decides to sell one because he had helped out a friend, but
no, he helped out his terrible coworker.
But
forced money from him.
I
He's
know,
nice.
but no, I know. I like how he sees the best in people,
Yeah.
even when they're the worst.
I agree with that. So I want to jump into how quirky and funny this film is on such a simplistic level, which I love so much about it. But this film consists of like a lot of funny moments that are just little looks that people are giving each other. Moments such as catching the eye of like a random stranger in the park and catching their quick looks back at you, which is that awkward, embarrassing moment where like, oh, they're staring at me.
Yep.
Or the humor in witnessing a coworker try to woo this girl that's completely not interested and he's just over trying it.
The one with the coworker is pretty funny because he almost arguably has more of a connection with the coworker because of the Patti Smith album than this coworker could ever hope to have with this person. Another detail I really like about him as a character is he takes his job very seriously. There's this sequence later in the film that his coworker doesn't show up and it's required of him to work through the night to compensate for that coworker. We see him angry, like a little disheveled, but frankly still up to the task. It's important to him that it's done well, and that couldn't be more different for this coworker who's a very minor character in the film, but I think shows the elegant simplicity of the way that he views his work life. A lot of people I think would look at cleaning toilets as like, I really failed in life, and he doesn't think that way at all.
That's an interesting point to bring up because that relates a little bit to his sister in the film.
Oh yeah, I want to talk about that. I have a whole thing on that, so I don't know if you want to wait.
All right, well, let's backtrack to one of the days that we see where his niece suddenly arrives at his house, and he hasn't seen her in quite a few years. She has grown a bit, which is the first thing he mentions. It's clear that she has run away from home and has come to visit him. He brings her out on his days of work, and she observes what he does until we finally see the mom arrive to pick her up. I thought this was very interesting because there's a clear difference in the way she's dressed from him. There's a clear difference in the way she arrived there, which she had a driver bring her in a really nice car.
Yep.
So she's clearly very wealthy and well off. And the conversations that he had with his niece about her dad, there's clear that they're just very two busy people that seem to put a lot of different things in front of the enjoying of maybe the simple things.
When we get this glimpse into his family life, it's kind of a sad and an emotional scene. And as a viewer, it offers you so little, but you get so much out of it just compared to the rest of the film. When the sister first comes out of the car, she says, "Oh, this is where you're living." And then she immediately recants that statement because it has this implicit judgment in asking, right? Almost as if she's anticipating the recurrence of an old judgment or an old argument between them.
Yeah.
There's also this little detail that he won't visit his father, who is seemingly has Alzheimer's and is in a nursing home. And I have to wonder if this is his whole family, if he comes from a fairly wealthy family and him living this more monastic lifestyle is him rejecting that. My film brain, having seen so many films, is always like interpreting. Like, where are we going? What's the plot structure? What's the character structure? As soon as I heard that, I said, I don't think this film is going to do this, but most films, when that nugget is dropped, it would end with him going to visit his father and overcoming the thing within
I was like,
him.
is this going to happen?
Yeah, and spoiler alert, he doesn't visit his father.
Yeah.
And the film is about more like marinating in his perspective than it is about any sort of change within him, which is really interesting because screenwriting 101 is have your characters change. Screenplays are all about change. They're all about the arc. And although he has some emotional moments in this film, I would almost argue that whatever his character arc is happens before the film starts, because he seems to be in a fairly good place, a fairly accepting place of himself once the film starts. And again, we just marinate in that perspective and see other people's reactions to it throughout the film and maybe get a deepening of that perspective from him. But he doesn't really change a tremendous amount from beginning to end, which is a really interesting choice.
Those precursor stories are alluded to in the movie by certain conversations, like the conversation he has with his niece, where he acutely describes his relationship with his sister and how they're on two different pages.
Yeah, he says like there's many worlds and she's one world and I'm another world.
Yeah, and so he already has this understanding of himself and who he is, and it's almost like all those details could have been a more dramatic movie before this movie.
Yeah, and what's so lovely about that scene actually is even though they live in different worlds, he can't help but hug her.
Yeah.
It's not that he holds that against her. He just understands that the way that she's living her life is not the way he wants to live his life. What's really interesting, too, at the end of that scene is he breaks down and he cries, which is the most emotional he is in the film, except for maybe the final shot, which I'm sure we'll talk about. What did you make of him crying at the end of that scene? Is it for the life he left behind? Is it just like general bittersweet melancholy of like he didn't understand how to process these emotions when this past life comes and intrudes on like his routine and his peaceful routine?
I don't know. I think it's all of those things. You can have multiple things. You can have feelings of sadness because you don't have relationships that you want, but still understand why they exist in the first place. So on that subject, we could talk a little bit about the end of the film, which I would consider a spoiler section. So if you have not seen the movie and you want to come back, we are going to talk about the final moments of this film and final moments leading up to the end. So,
and there is a shocking plot. No, there's not a shocking
There's not a shocking plot twist. There isn't really a shocking plot twist, but there is a scene that is illuminating in a certain regard to his character. And I do think it changes him in a little tiny ways, but he's going about one of his days and he arrives at one of these little restaurants that's run by a woman who ends up being the character that he only really talks to besides his niece and a couple other people towards the end of the film. But when he arrives there and he sees her opening up, he walks in and he sees her hugging another man. And he is immediately saddened by this because it's clear that he has feelings for her. He goes out and he buys a bunch of beers and he buys cigarettes and he goes to this waterway and he just starts drinking and smoking.
It sounds sick.
Which is absolutely hilarious because he hasn't smoked in years. So he immediately takes a drag from the cigarette and he just starts coughing. Interestingly enough, the guy from the restaurant ends up finding him and a conversation ensues that enlightens him on that conversation that it wasn't quite what it seemed.
I think that's really emblematic of one of the things that the film is about. And it was almost kind of something I talked about before, but it's these simple ideas that people find themselves engulfed in. He's dealing with, this person that he's having a connection with that has a cancer diagnosis that he's
terminal.
Yeah, that is terminal. And that's why he went back to that restaurant. They start talking about shadows. They play shadow tag. Again, this childlike sense of wonder and just this culmination and this focus on little details in their lives that I think really bring them a lot of joy. And it's one of the most touching scenes in the film.
Yeah, and it's something that complements the way he walks out every day and looks up at the sky and has this appreciation for, I'm living another day. To wake up every day and look at it with such optimistic eyes and wonder for the world as it exists, I think was a very beautiful, poignant moment to have.
I watch a lot of films about bad people and I watch a lot of films of like, how can these people be improved and look at all the mistakes they're making. I don't watch a lot of films where I say, I want to be more like this person. And in truth, I do want to be more like this main character. I think that we as viewers have a lot to learn from him.
Yeah. And so one of the final moments of this film, as we were alluding to earlier, of a close-up on him driving on a brand new day, and he is overcome with emotion listening to one of his cassette tapes.
He's listening to Nina Simone's Feeling Good.
Yeah,
very different.
Which is also very weird because he starts like breaking down crying at the same time.
I think those tears are very complex tears. We saw him cry earlier after he hugged his sister, and that was a very different type of crying. It was a crying that was full of despair. This was a thankful crying. It was a bittersweet crying. It was, I think, a crying that withstood all of the darkness in the world, but at the same time, like looked forward to it with a new day. I wouldn't want to characterize it exactly one way or the other because I think it has quite all of like the gamut of human emotion within those tears.
Which made it such a brilliant scene.
It just kept going on. I was just like, just let's keep going. You know, it went for almost the whole length of the song.
Well, when that moment started happening, I was like, oh, I have a feeling this is going to be the end of the movie somehow.
Yeah.
So I was like, please let this be the end because I was really satisfied. But I couldn't help feeling like I wanted to see another day of his.
Yeah.
Which was a wonderful thing to feel after feeling like you're watching a guy's life in mundanity. So are you ready to go to grades?
I give Perfect Days an A-. I think it is a lovely film. It's the Wim Wenders film I've seen that I identified the most with. There was something about this film that I was just on its level in a way that I don't often feel with films, especially about this elegant simplicity and this true like melancholy but like simultaneous joy of everyday life. I was very touched by it. And I think the unsung theme here is perspective. I have a really good friend who loves the film It's a Wonderful Life. And one of the things he likes to talk about with that film is that George Bailey, from when he wanted to commit suicide to when he absolutely loved his life, nothing at all tangibly changed in his life at all. It was only his perspective that changed. And I think that's what we can learn from this film is that if we just simply had a more thankful perspective, even with all of the trials we have in our lives, we would be so much happier. So I think it gives us something to aspire to, and I hope that I can. And I don't want to undermine any of the great filmmaking by not talking about that in my wrap up. I think the film is very well directed, and it's directed with a lot of detail and a lot of intent, and I just think that's extraordinary.
I completely agree, and I love how you said that this is a film, or characters in this film are worthy of aspiring to, because there is so much in this movie about how life can be simplistic and also just really lovely. Did I say my grade yet?
No,
I didn't. I give this movie an A.
Oh, Maddie likes it.
I really, really love this. This would have ended up in my top 10 if I could have added it to my top 10. So I'm not exactly sure where it would end up because it was a fantastic year, but it would kick something off the list, unfortunately. I think my lowest one was John Wick Chapter 4. So I think that one goes off the list, unfortunately.
Sorry, John Wick.
But it's still an honorable mention. Anyways, one of the biggest points and things I loved about this film, which I described earlier in this review, is the way that each day is treated, the differences in which angles are shot, and we see locations from different perspectives. And I think this movie intends to make an argument that mundanity itself doesn't exist, or at the very least that you could find something beautiful and different about each and every single day, even if you do the same things and you go the same places.
That's a very good point. I think mundanity comes with like, it's almost like a pejorative, like it has a negative connotation that it doesn't necessarily need to have, that this film shows us.
All right, and that's it for our review of Perfect Days. Perfect Days is now in select theaters, so if you haven't seen it, go check it out if it's playing near you. Please let us know in the comments, what did you think about Perfect Days? As always, thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next time.